All right, I want to jump onto another question now, and I'm going to stick in a way tangentially to the topic of Hanukkah, because this is the time of year where you will see politicians who span from the most pro Jewish to the most certainly anti Zionist out there, who will post messages wishing the Jewish community a very happy Hanukkah and what an important festival. It commemorates the Maccabees, the Hasmonean dynasties, victory. And you think, gosh, this is a bit odd that people who don't believe in the Jewish people's right to or ancient connection to the land of Israel, saying, offering good wishes to the Jewish community, which is celebrating a festival all about the Jewish people reclaiming sovereignty thousands of years ago over the land of Israel. You see it with like Ilan Omar, Jeremy Corbyn, and others. It's rather ironic, isn't it?
Yeah, well, first of all, they're just big politicians,
Yeah.
Politicians want votes regardless of where they come from. So it's sort of, de rigueur to wish everyone, especially at holiday season, it happens to be the Jewish and Christian holidays fall at the same time, Passover and Easter and Christmas and Hanukkah. So it's kind of the thing to do. But also, in keeping with kind of the idea of intersectionality, there's a theme within both Passover and Hanukkah, albeit greatly misunderstood and overly simplified, about struggles for freedom, which resonates with all people, even if there, as you say, this tremendous disconnect between the modern state of Israel and the biblical Hebrews. And you should know that a lot of people who don't like Jews in the present love the ancient Hebrews. The Maccabees are a great example of this. Who loved the Maccabees more than anyone else? Well, first of all, modern secular Zionists loved the Maccabees because they were fighters. They completely missed the whole spiritual side of their struggle. But unlike so many Jews in Europe before the Holocaust and during the Holocaust, who went like sheep to the slaughter, which is a very unfair view of these people, the Maccabees were fought. They were warriors. They're really holy warriors. But the Crusaders loved the Maccabees. The
Wow.
Crusaders are the people who slaughtered the Jews. They
Wow.
loved King David because they represented the Crusaders. Actually got the Maccabees better than the secular Zionist movement did, because they appreciated they were holy warriors. They were dying for their faith. And Christianity took the idea of dying for your faith and made it into a whole literary genre of martyrdom during the early Roman persecution of Christianity. They just took our idea and took it to a new level. Dying for your faith was something only Jews did in the ancient world, and they picked up on it. So they really loved that idea. And the Crusaders viewed themselves as holy warriors for Christ, So there's a lot of different things going on there, but there's a tremendous disconnect between the Bible and biblical Hebrews and those people and these Jews today I can't stand, or, Israel, which is not the same thing. The fact that they don't recognize that the Hanukkah story takes place in the land of Israel about, I don't know, 800 years before Islam shows up in the land of Israel is completely lost on people. But that's the facts that people just don't get. They're just kind of throwing out their general ill-founded but well-intended holiday wishes.
Yeah. Well, the reason why I brought this up was because I wanted to talk to you specifically about Zionism and its connection with Judaism. You are a passionate, observant Jew, and also a passionate Zionist. And you do hear sometimes from some people, from I'd say a fringe of the religious Jewish community, that say there's no connection between Zionism, or at least modern Zionism, and Judaism. Judaism is just a religion, and that's it. And then you have people who on the far left that say similar things, that say that Zionism has nothing to do with Judaism and it's a secular project, it's a colonialist, oppressive project, and all the rest of it. I mean, the first thing I'd say is, have these people even opened a Bible? Like, like the land of Israel, it's literally the story of the Jewish people heading towards the land of Israel. I mean, that always is a little bit beyond me, how that seems to have escaped them. But I wondered if you could talk about this, you're so passionate about this, and to help explain to our viewers the connection between Zionism, and I'm not necessarily talking about any specific strand of Zionism, but the idea, the principle of yearning to return to a land, our ancient connection to the land, having the right to self-determination there, and its connection with Judaism. If you could talk about that and make the case.
Sure. Well, first of all, even the people who are of the very ultra-Orthodox world, which is a very small minority, like Neturia Karta, or a little less so, like maybe Satmar Hasidim, who are hardcore anti-Zionist, they wouldn't say it's because Judaism is a religion and not a people. They get the point. They understand that Judaism is God, Torah, and the land of Israel. They make a distinction between Eretz Israel, which is the land of Israel, and Medinat Israel, which is the state.
You say that. I have actually heard, I think the website is called like Torah True Jews or something like that, where their main spokesperson said, we are a religion. We are just a religion.
That's just a ridiculous statement that comes completely from ignorance. Jews are a people. We're a nation. We have a land, a language, and a history. I don't know which person said that, but they're completely mistaken. But I know, as a rule, in general, the Orthodox world's objection to Zionism, which begins, really through the birth of Zionism, which is the late 19th, early 20th century, comes overwhelmingly from the notion that the movement was founded by a bunch of Jews who are not observant. We're trying to create a state that was not a Jewish state, but a state for Jews, to be like all the nations of the world. And they basically felt that we only lost the land of Israel because we didn't keep the Torah. How are a bunch of people who are not keeping the Torah going to be able to refound a Jewish state? So that was the opposition. Most people have moved more where most of the yeshiva world of the diaspora, which is the Haredi world, is nowhere near as antagonistic as today. Some of that residual animus still is there, that the government of Israel is not a Torah state, etc. But I think the vast majority of people who are even opponents, who are Orthodox Jews, Haredim, as we would call them, the ultra-Orthodox, who would say they're not Zionist, would not deny the very deep and profound and central connection the Jewish people have as a people with the land of Israel, and the necessity of having the land of Israel as a prerequisite for fulfilling what our destiny is and maximizing our spiritual potential, precisely because so many of the commandments of Judaism are related to being in the land and having Jerusalem and having a temple and the temple service and all of those things. So I don't think the vast majority of people who call themselves non-Zionist would fit into that category. I think they actually get that. The reality is, I do a whole class on this. We see that, like Rabbi Abraham Isaac of Cohen Cook, who was the first chief rabbi of Free State Palestine, he had a little broader view. He himself was very religious. He wore the whole Strimal for hat thing and everything. But he saw that God was working behind the scenes, and even the secular Zionists, even if they weren't doing it for the right reason, were actually part of the process of redemption and part of the Messianic process is absolutely, very clearly, the return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel. And he saw that as part of the process, and he was willing to work with them, whereas much of the rabbinic leadership of Europe just stood back and said, we're not having to do with these people. They're dangerous.
And I would suspect, by the way, that Rav Kook, with his Hasidic lens on, probably saw within the secular Zionist pioneers, probably deep down within their souls, a Pintel Yid, a burning Jewish soul that had this
clearly did
intangible connection to Israel. Yeah,
they clearly did. So that's from that side. But the state of Israel was founded by a bunch of non-religious people, and now, whereas in 1900, 0.5% of the Jews in the world lived in that state, today half the Jews in the world live in that state. The explosion of Jewish population in the land of Israel, precisely when the Jewish world population isn't going anywhere, is one of the great phenomenon. It's really quite supernatural. It's, the world's population has gone up like 350% since the end of World War II. The Jewish population has gone from 11 to maybe 12, 13, 14 million, which is nothing. But the population of the land of Israel has gone up about 1,050%, 3 times what the world's has done. So it's clearly a part of that ingathering process, which, by the way, the religious Zionist movement, the Gush Emunim movement, which founded after the 1967 war with the reunification of Jerusalem, viewed it all very much as a messianic process. The return of Jews to Israel, but the reunification of Jerusalem and the ability to now resettle the biblical heartland, which was the part that Jordan occupied for 19 years, Judea and Samaria, which is today erroneously called the West Bank. It's all part of this process of redemption, of a physical return, which will be followed by a spiritual return. But to go to the other side of the coin, you're mentioning those people who claim that, on the other side, you get more of this: Jews are just a religion. Not only a religion, you're not an ethnicity, and you have no claim to anyone's land because you're from, like, Poland. You're Eastern Europeans, which of course is a gross misunderstanding of the history of Jewish migration from place to place. 1,000 years ago, 90% of the Jews in the world lived in the Middle East and were what we call the Edot HaMizrach, the fact that because of circumstances, expulsions and migrations, in the last 500 to 700 years or so, that switched over to the majority of the Jews migrating to Eastern Europe because they were invited in there. No way, if you rewind the tape, Ollie, you go back to everyone going back to the land of Israel. So, but the attempt by the other extreme to do that is to deny the Jewish people the right to a homeland. Just say that you are a colonial project, you're non-indigenous, you're Slavic, you come from Eastern Europe, you're a religion, not a people, and the Europeans, out of guilt for what they didn't do to save you during the Holocaust, stole the territory from the indigenous Palestinian population and gave it to people who have no rights there, which is wrong on so many levels I can't begin to count. But that's the way it's being sold. So both sides, an extreme, it's trying to undermine Jewish nationalism, but to try and compare what maybe the anti-Zionist, hardcore, ultra-Orthodox world is with the anti-Semites on the other side would be very unfair. It's coming from a different place, but the consequences are very dangerous, by the way. And the worst expression of that is when you see when AIPAC, the American Israel Public Action Committee, which is the largest Jewish lobby and one of the largest lobbies in Washington, has its conference, its policy conference. And like Washington, when you have a bunch of Naturia Carta, which is a very teeny small section of the ultra-Orthodox anti-Zionist world, sitting outside with Palestinian flags over them, like they're wearing a talit, and joining with the Palestinians protesting the Jewish state. That is the most warped convergence of two antithetical ideologies into one. But then again, that's a teeny tiny percentage of that it's literally, we're talking about hundreds of people in the vast world of what's the Jewish world. I think the vast majority of Jews in the world appreciate that Jewish people are a people and we have a country, and it's a legitimate state, even though I think most Jews do not appreciate anything about our history and how long we've been around and how deep and how old our connection is both to Israel and Jerusalem.
And just for context, the reason why there was a lot of religious opposition towards Zionism as it began was because the founders were quite passionately secularist, socialist, Western liberal kind of mindset in terms of the country they wanted to create. And so would you agree there was understandable fear and concern initially, and that over the last 70 years Israel has become, I think I'm seeing this more and more, it's a society that's becoming, I think, more and more comfortable with its with having a religious nature, and even those who would consider themselves, I don't like these titles, like chilonim, the secular, are slowly becoming more accustomed to, more interested in Jewish practice and letting it just be very naturally part of their day-to-day life.
100%. 100% in that number one, early Zionism. And again, I'm a huge Zionist, so I'm not attacking, but early Zionism basically believed that the diaspora had turned the Jewish people into a very beaten down, unempowered people, and nationalism being such a strong concept in the late 19th century, especially, we need to create a new kind of Jew, a Hebrew. And Judaism kept Jews Jewish in diaspora, but we're creating a new kind of Jew. Yes, he has the Bible, not as a religious text, but it's our history. I mean, Ben Gurion knew the Bible. He was the first prime minister, and he knew the Bible better than almost any rabbi, and he really knew it and his Jewish history, but he viewed it as our national history. We have holidays like, Sukkot and Pesach, but they're not religious holidays. They're like planting and harvesting holidays because we're going back to our land. So, and there was definitely within the secular Zionist ideology an idea of secularizing, especially the Sephardic Jews who were basically evacuated from the Middle East, which was ethnically cleansed of 800,000 Middle Eastern Jews between 48 and 67. They were literally forced out or airlifted out by Israel because of persecution in the Arab lands between the War of Independence and the 67 Six-Day War. There was definitely a lot of damage was done to these Jews who were very traditional people by the political left of Israel, which was the Labour Party. Ironically, as you say correctly, what's happened in Israel starting in 1977, when the first time you had a non-Labour Party government, Menachem Begin of the political right, who was, while not religious, much more traditional and much more kindly disposed towards the Sephardim, was elected into power. Just the demographics of what goes on in the state of Israel and the high birth rates in the religious communities, especially, and the fact that the reality of living in the Middle East. I always jokingly say, to want an open border with Mexico, you got to live in Vermont. And when you live in a country where within the maximum distance is 50 miles, of the absolute maximum is a guy who wants you dead, and he's right on your border, and you're surrounded by him on all sides. You live in a certain reality here, where Israel is actually moving politically to the right, as we saw in the last election. The only reason why there would ever be a non-right-wing government in Israel is only because the right's infighting politically. But even spiritually, is despite I think if you could bring back the early Zionist leadership of pre-state and early state, they would be horrified at how traditionally connected most Jews are. And my opinion, it's going to sound really harsh, and some religious Jews are going to get upset by it, but in my opinion, it's very clear. I live in Israel 40 years. The number one reason that there are not hundreds of thousands of Jews who are more Jewish, it's because of how they view their Jewish religious brethren who look at them, who are not welcoming to them and want to keep them away. Because what happened, it's another trend that doesn't just happen in the modern state of Israel. It's been happening for the last few centuries. Precisely when Europe goes into the Enlightenment, okay, a little glitch on the radar screen, is the Holocaust, but precisely when the violent anti-Semites seem to be waning, the new enemy becomes from within. It was a Jew who was formerly an assimilationist, who, recognizing assimilation isn't working, now becomes a Zionist, and now he's going to steal. I can read you quotes from this. He's going to steal our children and take them into the secular political ideology, which is going to remove them from Judaism. So the enemy of the Jewish world went from being a physical threat to a spiritual ideological threat. The new enemy is now no longer a pogroming Cossack. It's a secular Zionist who wants you to make a Jewish nationalist without Judaism. It's going to be a Bundist or a communist. It's going to get you into the secular religion of the workers of the world unite kind of thing. So the Jewish world, precisely when the walls of the ghettos are coming down after the Napoleonic Wars in the early 19th century, they recreate their own virtual walls. And anyone who's really honest about the Orthodox Jewish world, the more religious it is, the more you see this, recognizes that there's a lot of, I would say, collective post-traumatic stress, especially in the Ashkenazic Jewish world. And the fear factor and the idea of trying to keep out threats, not physical threats anymore, but don't let that in, don't let this idea in, has made a world that's very reactionary and very closed and very insular and very unwelcoming to a lot of other Jews in Israel who are now way past the early secular Zionist propaganda of religion is outmoded and really want the spirituality and the deeper connection, which is why you even have secular yeshivas in Israel, where people are learning Talmud, but they're not keeping Shabbat because they're really thirsty for it. And there's no doubt in my mind, if first the Orthodox Jewish world, and I say the more religious you look, the more people look at you and expect more from you. That specifically that part of the world that lives in places like Mea Shearim and Bnei Brak were to be first do no harm, as we say in the Hippocratic Oath. Don't throw things and yell Shabbat at people who are driving on the Sabbath who don't know any better. First don't do that. And then ideally just be smile. And then even more than that, be welcoming. There's no question in my mind you would have a massive wave of Jews returning and reconnecting to Judaism.
And would you agree with me that we're already starting to? I personally, just from my even experiences with diaspora Jews, just seeing their Yiddishkeit, Judaism, slowly just becoming, not in any big dramatic way, but in slow ways, just more part of their day-to-day lives in a very natural, healthy way.
Yeah, well, people genuinely want it. It's interesting. I interact with a lot of Jews who are not Orthodox. I'm amazed at the most recent thing, because I'm a tour guide and I get a lot of people coming through who are not religious. I am shocked at how many of them, pretty much all of them, go to a Chabad house now. None of them are Orthodox, but they're all connected to Chabad. And Chabad does one thing they get, besides boldly going in the words of Star Trek, where no Jew will ever go, like the top of the Himalayas, they got a Chabad house. They get one thing really, really right about being inclusive. It's being not exclusive, not pushing away, but welcoming in. And they look really religious. So it's amazing how, just by the fact that they're welcoming and non-judgmental, I'm shocked at how many people are attracted to them and go to Chabad houses for whatever amount of time they decide they're going to do something spiritual, whether it's the high holidays, Passover, occasionally going for Friday night. They want to go to the Chabad house because these guys have the real deal. They got the spirituality that we want, the connection we want, and they're not judging me and they're
Yeah.
not pushing me away. They're welcoming me. And that should be a big wake up call and a huge lesson. And people like Rav Noach Weinberg, the father of, the founder of Eshet Torah and really one of the fathers of the Baal Tshuva movement, was the first person to show that the best defense is a good offense, and self-ghettoization never works. Building up
Yeah.
walls never works. Ask the French about the Maginot Line in World War II. We see how well that worked. You gotta realize we got a great product, and we have to go out there and spread the word. And now, thankfully, the difference I've seen since I've been in this world for 40 years is when I first came, people were like, "Nah, you can't really impact secular Jews." Now you have things like Project Inspire. At least in the yeshiva community, which is kind of the black hatted community in America and in England also, I think, and other places, there's an idea that, you can have Shabbat guests, you can welcome people, there's educational content we can give, and even if I'm not going to be a teacher, I can have a guest in my home, and they'll give me I have the confidence that I can actually open my doors to these people, and they won't, like, God forbid my kids won't see a secular Jew and go off and become secular themselves. So there's definitely been a big change in that respect, but a lot more needs to be done, and especially in Israel. The number one thing keeping Jews in Israel from being more religious is the religious Jewish community. There's no question. And I see this also because I go all over the world speaking. Take Israelis out of Israel and put them in diaspora. A lot of them go live there. There is a huge percentage of Israelis living abroad. They either assimilate completely because they have no Jewish connection. It was just Israeli. But a lot of them now are much more interested because their objections to Judaism had nothing to do with Judaism theologically or observance-wise. It was about their perception of Orthodox Jews, whether it's they don't serve in the army, they don't pay the taxes, they don't like me, they hate me, they're taking but not giving, whatever it is. It's all politics and perception and nothing to do with, it's like the wrapping, the external, nothing to do with the package itself, which they really want, what's inside the wrapping.
And by the way, I'd always want to say, in fairness, the Haredi community in Israel, a lot of this comes from pent-up fear over, as you were discussing, huge amounts of fear over, thinking the government, wants to secularize them and strip them of their spiritual identity. One of the things that I think you are right to note that Chabad really get right, where they go out into the world, without fear and yet uncompromising, and they don't lose their religious identity. And I think part of the recipe that works so well is their understanding that God needs every single person for a unique, specific role, which means that they have their sense of meaning and purpose, which they cling to and therefore don't compromise on. But also it means they see every single Jew and every single human being as worthy of respect and communication and embracing, because they're just as necessary in the wider plan. And so I think that's a big part of it.
That's huge. And the problem with the Jewish world, I always say, is we are so busy fighting amongst ourselves, not just an Orthodox versus secular. It goes the other way also. But it's a fundamental point in Judaism that those who know, those who are connected, have a greater level of responsibility. And, you have the more insular and ultra Orthodox that world becomes, the less they look at their secular Jews as even Jews. I hate to say that, but I've heard comments made walking on streets that I don't want to go into them because I was horrified that people would even say these things. But I know when God's looking down, he goes, that's your brother, that's your sister, and you know better than they do, and I'm going to hold you responsible. But I would say, without picking on one specific group, the big paradigm shift the Jewish world absolutely has to make now is to start focusing on what unites us and not what divides us. And I've seen situations where literally there's an organization called Common Denominator. I once watched an event where they brought Jews from a Hashomer Hatzair kibbutz. These are kibbutzim which in the 40s and 50s would have pork barbecues on Yom Kippur. They were the most anti-religious places. And of course, they're much less so now. Some of them have synagogues today on their kibbutzim, but putting them in the deepest, darkest part of Mea Shearim, the most insular part, and they actually, the first time these people ever interacted.
Wow.
And it's amazing how, even though they're such different worlds, how much they actually get along and actually talk. This holds true for human nature in general, by the way. We tend to demonize people and put them in a box and say that's the way they are, and not look at them as individuals. It's far harder to hate people you relate to as a human being and you have a relationship with than someone who's this, demonized, faceless force that's coming after you in some way. But I always say, when you talk about anti-Semitism before, the people who hate us do not distinguish between what we believe in and how we practice, whether we're conservative, liberal, reform, or or conservative, Orthodox, live in Israel, don't, Ashkenazi, Sephardi. The people who hate us, I always say, it sounds kind of harsh, but in Auschwitz there's only one line. All Jews, the people who hate us look at us as one Jews, and that's on a very high level being told that if that's the way people who hate us look at us, how much more so we can agree to disagree with each other. We can have our red lines in terms of what we're willing to do. I don't have to do what you're doing because you're Jewish. I'm not going to violate Shabbat, so you'll like me better. But I can still have a relationship with you. I can disagree with what you're doing. I'm not going to judge you and try and force you to do anything. But you're my brother. You're my sister. All parents get this point, by the way. You don't always like your kids, but you always love them. That's how teenagers survive, by the way.
Absolutely.
If the Jewish world were to make a paradigm shift of, look, we can agree to disagree, but we're all in this boat together, and we have to pull together and focus on what unites us and not what divides us, you would see a massive change within the energy of the Jewish people, and I believe you'd see a huge lessening of external threats to us in anti-Semitism. First of all, unity is always a great. When we have Jews undermining, we have some of the biggest enemies of the Jewish people in Israel are Jews. A huge percentage of people who are students for justice in Palestine are misguided Jewish students who, because of intersectionality, put the Palestinians and Black Lives Matter and everything's in the same box. And these are all persecuted people I have to feel bad for, because Jews, we tend to feel bad for and worry about everyone but ourselves. We have Jews for every ism but Judaism. So it's a huge point that we really need to become cognizant of.
Yeah,
and
couldn't agree more.
Key thing to really make a change in the Jewish world. Before we bring people back to Judaism, we first have to, start respecting and loving each other.
I couldn't agree more with that.